And then I will share my screen and we'll start right in on this session. And I do want to say that this particular session is, I'm kind of fond of this session, this concept of self-directed. You'll hear me speak quite a bit and use these terms interchangeably of self-directed and self-regulated. And the reason why this is kind of interesting to me is that oddly enough, about 22, 23 years ago, seems like forever ago, this was actually part of my doctoral dissertation study to really monitor, examine, and determine how college students were able to direct and regulate their own learning online. So it's, you might realize it's just quite interesting to me to see where we are now and what's happened over the past 2 decades. Well, a lot has happened around the world. Unfortunately, it hasn't been really targeted and focused on education and kind of more in a systematic way. And so I'll share with you some of the research. I'll share with you some strategies, and I hope that some of this is really going to be beneficial to you in your teaching. As we always do, I'm going to start off with some learning outcomes. I'm hoping that over the next 55 minutes or so, that after this, we'll be able to do a few of these. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to share the kind of some operational definitions of some words. Chances are you've seen these terms. You probably know the definition of these terms in your program. I know that most TESOL programs do a pretty good job with pedagogy and learning theories. But these 5 terms in particular, I want to try to help us understand and help us realize how they're connected, because they are connected very closely. As I mentioned, the self-directed, self-regulated, I'll kind of speak in those in the same way. But there is a relationship between self-efficacy, metacognition, and information processing that hopefully you'll be able to see. I'm going to basically share also, how we can develop and help our students to be more self-regulating online. We'll try to get some strategies for them, some very clear strategies, hopefully that you can embed inside of your program when you're teaching online. But to be quite honest, these strategies work anywhere, anytime, whether we're online, offline, K through 12, K through 24. These are some pretty foundational strategies to help us understand how adults learn. And then I will share with you what's called a kind of a diagnostic. This would be a questionnaire, a survey that was developed several years ago. And if you're interested in trying to determine your or your students' kind of relative ability to regulate, you might want to implement this diagnostic to help determine that. So you're going to see a lot of circles, a lot of cycles. I thought I would start off with this as kind of a background, and hopefully you're thinking about this. And one of the things that I want to caution us all very early is that this concept of any kind of a cycle or self or thinking, internal kind of processing, this is, it's fairly natural to very young humans, but then something happens. We tend to kind of almost at times educate that out of a lot of people. And then as adults, we regain that because maybe we have to. We don't have teachers or people who are really over us telling us how to think and how to process. And so a lot of this is going to be helping students and people in general really get back to the way that the brain naturally kind of functions. I did want to start with these 2 terms. You can see that they're kind of right next to each other and they both have their advantages. I also want to remind us that everything I do, as you'll see, have nice little names and parentheses and commas and dates that we're, as now, graduate students or graduates of graduate programs, we know the importance of citing work, using work, basing things on research. And so I try to include a lot of those. So you'll see that basically this concept of self-directed is just that, right? These are English words that mean somebody's doing something on their own. Now, this doesn't mean that it's self-taught. This is something very clear that I want to make sure that just because you're self-directed doesn't mean that they don't need teachers, we don't need lessons and syllabus and all those things. All of these are materials that help everyone kind of move along in a very efficient, effective way. So it's having all of these available to students, not just portions of them. But to do, people who are self-directed, they basically take initiative. We'll talk a little bit more about how they know when they need to take this initiative, and that's part of the cycle and reprocessing of some ideas. And then ultimately they assess, measure, and evaluate their own learning. I'm hoping those are the terms from last time that we spoke. You're starting to think and implement this concept of this three-step process of assessment, measurement, and evaluation. And I realized that last week was pretty dense, pretty substantial material. And now what's really one of my goals is to, in this 50 to 55 minutes each week, give you a lot of information to think about. I certainly hope that you don't think that you're gonna know it all from just this 50 minutes of listening to me. But I hope that where you are in your career and your scholarly kind of endeavors, you're able to take some of these terms, make some connections, and then have an action plan, how you might further unpack and use some of these terms. But I'll be focusing a lot on the other side here of self-regulation. And what's nice about this, similar to self-directed, is that this is something that we can teach. It's a competency, it's a skill that we can teach our students to do more regularly. And many advantages, right? It's going to reduce instructional time, and that's always a positive. But I'm hearing more and more that when we're online, that's even more of a positive, because time is really precious. Not just because we may not have all the time that we normally would have had face-to-face, but being online on Zooms, I like being on these Zooms, and I just love the ability to connect with each of you, thousands and thousands of miles away. At the same time, it's not the same, but it also is a very different energy level working online. And I'm sure that you've realized this, that 1 hour on Zoom equals a couple of hours in the classroom. And so managing time, being efficient with time, having students regulate their own learning is going to really be helpful when we're working online. All of this really kind of includes cycles, and there's lots and lots of cycles. So it involves agency and purpose and perceptions. But the bottom line is that this doesn't happen in isolation. There's actually a lot of things that are going together. So that's why I wanted to mention these few things, such as self-efficacy and how students are coming to us and their thoughts. I can't imagine that everyone has heard of this word before. I think it's one of the most powerful terms out there and portions of our learning theories. And even if you don't remember or want to use this larger word of metacognition, there's another very simple word that it really represents, which is reflection, right? It's this concept of reflecting in a way and in a timely way that helps us understand what do we know? What don't we know? What do we need to know? How do we know we know we know? And that's why I kind of put in red up there, is that this is one of the simplest definitions I've ever seen in my life. But metacognition is this concept of thinking about thinking. And at first that seems like an odd statement, but then if we really think about that, we may know something, we may verbalize something, we may do something, but are we actually thinking about how we came to those conclusions, how we actually kind of process that? And I think that that's something that's really key, is that we need to think about that ourselves. And I'll share some strategies to help us understand that. So this is another, I don't want to make this sound like really specific and concrete. There isn't one cycle for self-regulation, one cycle for self-directed, one cycle for metacognition, one cycle for self-efficacy. It's this really unique system of all of these cycles kind of interchange, and it is complex. So that's something that we need to realize, that it's not going to be really this very linear path. We need to understand it well enough so that we can actually help students apply this when they need that. To do that, and this is something that I do in my class that I've seen to be very successful, is we need to start to kind of acculturate or train or really help our students become more metacognitive. This is something that I have found, maybe you have, maybe you have not, but I've found that they are a bit resistant to initially. Because at first this seems like extra. It seems like extra time. It seems like maybe a waste of time, because it's not taking them from where they're at to points, to completing a homework, to a grade. In actuality, this is, once they understand that this not only is helpful, but it can help them understand and connect deeper and quicker and richer and more long-lasting. So I do an assignment. I provide my students an assignment every week. They have to share with me a reflection. And I basically say, the whole point here is that something's going to happen during the week, both in class and out of class, and assignments and talking to your colleagues. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to really sit down and find, 5, 10, 20 minutes and reflect upon that. And I'd like you to write one paragraph. And the way that I kind of train them into this is that I give them these prompts. And so they have to answer these prompts. Now, I'm guessing my students are similar to your students, and most students, is their first reaction is to think that this is a question and answer. So they'll literally answer these questions. And I'll have to, after the first time they do it, I'll have to kind of pause and I'll say, that's not what we're doing. This is not a test or a quiz. What I'd like you to do is to, pick a few of these and really think about what happened in your lives and how what we did in the classroom has connected to that, and create a bit of a storyline. Now, for me, I think it's easy. Maybe it is easy for your disciplines as well, but I teach environmental chemistry. And so I challenge them, what's happened in your life with the environment? What the water that you drank, the air that you breathed, the things that you saw on the roadside, where did you take your garbage? All kinds of things like this, and they'll make these connections. And so little by little, through the semester, they start to then foster their own abilities, right? Like how they know something, what kind of evidence do they have? How reliable? What am I connecting things to? What did I know before? What do I know now? How am I going to connect this to the future? And the big thing is, so what? What does this have to do with anything at all? My life, others' lives, the world, those kind of things. And so these are the kind of questions that should almost be obsessively in our minds, going around and round. Once we interact with some sort of a concept, how are we making these connections? And so that's one part of self-regulation. There's other parts where we have to kind of do something with that. And the last two terms here, and again, I'm trying not to complicate things, but I can't have a really meaningful conversation about self-regulated learning unless we do know that these terms and these concepts are in the background. Hopefully some of us remember, seems like years ago, but it was a few months ago, we did talk quite a bit about this concept of information processing. This is how our brain processes information. And so if we're going to regulate, we need to know what we're regulating. We need to know how we're attending to input, what portion of our stimulus and our sensories are actually gathering those, and how we're actually making that connection between short-term and long-term memory. Self-regulation, there's a little micro loop right there between STM, or the working memory, and long-term memory that should be constantly asking us, okay, I saw that, I heard that, but how can I use that? And what if I needed to use that later? And what does it have to do with my career or my degree or my interactions? So we should constantly be thinking about if we are actually transferring that information from short-term to long-term memory. That's a micro self-regulated, self-directed cycle in itself. And then lastly, a big characteristic that will either encourage us and is usually a big indicator of whether students can currently or have the propensity to regulate their learning online is their self-efficacy. And this concept is fairly straightforward. Some people confuse it with self-esteem, and that's a little bit different. Self-esteem is emotionally what we think about ourselves, but self-efficacy is really targeted on a discipline. How good am I in math? How good am I in science? I think that I am very good at math. I may not be as good in writing or history or psychology. These are our own thoughts about how good we are, how effective we can be in a particular topic, concept, discipline. Keeping in mind, this may or may not be accurate. Just because we think we're good at something doesn't necessarily mean we are. And I find this a lot, and that's why we work with students and figure out if they are good at those things. It doesn't hurt to have high self-efficacy, but we have seen some studies where a false elevated self-efficacy can sometimes lead to lower preparation, because a student may think that they know something, therefore they don't really prepare adequately. And so what does it have to do with self-regulation? Well, by gathering the evidence, whether they know it or not, they're going to actually be more accurate at determining their own self-efficacy on whether they do know something or not. So those are the 5 terms that I want us to really kind of keep in the back of our mind. And I know this is a lot. I can't help but think that you've run across these terms before, but just kind of realizing that none of this is done in isolation. The diagnostic that I mentioned that I would be sharing this is what it's called. It's called the Motivated Strategies for Learning Questionnaire, or the Mslq. This was developed about 25 years ago by Pintrich out of the University of Michigan. And this was actually one of the instruments that I used in my dissertation 20 years ago. It's a 72-item questionnaire. And the really nice thing about this is a couple things. First of all, it's broken up into categories. I'm going to show you two of those, one of them on this screen and then the next screen. This screen is for self-efficacy. The next screen will be for self-regulated learning and metacognition. The nice thing is that basically students, they answer these questions. And not that it's perfect. I mean, surveys are only as good as they're built. They spent a lot of time on this. I think this is a better indirect measure, a better survey than most, because they did what's called reverse code some of these. And what that means is basically they would have multiple questions on the same topic, but they're phrased in a different way and reversed, some being a positive, some being a negative. And so that the students can't kind of game or try to give the answer that they think they should give, because typically the statistics will check if they're not providing the same answer on the same topic. So these are little kind of things that we do in our surveys to make sure that they're a little more rigorous than just a simple, what do you do, what do you like? But I'm talking along here, I'm sure that you're reading these. You can certainly take portions of these and you can create your own questionnaires and surveys for students. But I think this is one of the first steps of just trying to figure out, where are students on the scale? This has become somewhat common in some community colleges in the US that offer a lot of online learning courses. They'll provide this type of a diagnostic to students ahead of time, so the students can at least understand where they might be. And if they come up with a low value on this, then they have to kind of think about whether they want to take that online course or they want to go get some tutoring or some sort of supplemental instruction before they take it. But it's a really nice awareness to understand where students are at before they begin some of these. And as I mentioned, there's another whole section on metacognition and self-regulated learning. By the way, you'll see me start to abbreviate throughout the rest of this presentation. Self-regulated learning is SRL. So if you see SRL, that's what it means, self-regulated. And these questions, I'm sure you're reading these and you're thinking, okay, that makes sense, studying and before I study in and when the teacher's talking and when I stop. Chances are you're even thinking of some students that do some of these well, some that don't do these well. And so ultimately for this session, I'm going to share with you some strategies that you can share with your students who might, if they attend to these strategies, they'll start to improve on their ability to self-regulate. Another thing we might think about, Knowles came up with this concept, right now we're talking about these ideas and these theories. And so now I'm going to really get into the pragmatic portion of how we can really assist our students in becoming more self-regulated. The first step is we may just develop something like a contract. And what Knowles developed, these 7 steps, and this is something that you work with each individual students, and they basically set up these, what are their needs? You might know some of those, they might know some of those, the outcomes, which you should have for each of your sessions and your concepts. They specify the resources and the strategies, which may be different for each student. Evidence, as we talked about last time, is really big. How are they going to share that evidence? It isn't just the homework or the completion of the homework. I'll share with you some really clear, specific strategies on additional evidence that you may want to gather to identify at what level the students are operating into this regulation. Then you have to connect these things and then assess and measure. So this is just an idea and some prompts that you don't need to use all of these, and you'll see with all of these, the remaining of the resources that I share, they're a menu, and I hope that you can kind of look through those and say that this will fit your need now and maybe later, but these are all kind of an extended menu of things you may want to use. I do always like to share research. I think that this is really what hopefully differentiates the Center for Teaching from folks that are just using these kind of tools. But fortunately, as I mentioned, I've been involved in this research for over 20 years, and I think it's kind of interesting that it's kind of come full circle. I've continued to publish an update on some of this research, and so I'll share with you some recent research that I did just a couple of years ago, because obviously maybe some of our students 20 years ago are different than our students now. And so a colleague of mine, basically went out and we repeated some of these things using Pinterest Motivated Strategy Learning Questionnaire Survey, and we found some really interesting things. First of all, in general, currently, many of our students possess a very low level of this. Now, I'm sure that if I could see your faces, there wouldn't be a lot of surprises. You're probably realizing, yeah, that's one of the weaknesses, and that's probably why you were interested in this topic. They do have typically high expectations of themselves, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But what we found is that when that's coupled with their lack of self-regulation, sometimes they make this assumption that just by believing in themselves, they'll be successful, which we know is not true. We need to be thinking about that they're not using these cognitive learning skills, right? These information processing skills, these metacognition skills, these self-regulative skills. And so therefore they tend to realize they're not being as successful. They tend to procrastinate, push things off, wait till the last minute. They become disengaged in class, out of class, with assignments. And for the most part, they still are reluctant to contact anyone for assistance. And we'll talk about some strategies to help with that. So most of them want to do well, but they lack this preparation. And that's why I was really excited to see that people were interested in this topic, because I do think that this is a major strategy that's lacking in most of our schools. And I think that it's something that we can actually teach. And I think it could have a significant impact on students' achievement. So fine, we just identified that this is going on. I think that was no surprise to you. Chances are you were thinking, yep, that's not a lot of my students are able to do that. So how can we change that? How can we modify that? And so here's some techniques that we can use to encourage self-regulated learning. The first thing is just to model these examples. I think far too often we forget what it was like before we knew the material, and we stand up and we talk, we write, we do problems, and we're focusing on the answers, or we're focusing on making sure that it's correct. And we probably should do a lot more of narrating, why are we making these decisions? Why are we taking this approach? How are we making the connection, embedding this integration of these concepts? Because for me, I want my students to not only be a chemist, I want them to think like a chemist and process like a chemist. And so I have to kind of work them through some of these details. So it's easy to talk about support, but we forget sometimes that this is very unfamiliar to some students that might be out of the discipline. And each of our disciplines have very specific ways sometimes at going about things. So providing this support in those contexts. I always remind my students, you are the manager of your own learning. You're the director, you're the supervisor. Sometimes they think that's us. And I remind them that I'm a facilitator, I'm a guide, I'm a resource, but I'm not the one in control here. You're the one that's going to determine how much you work, how much you don't work, how hard you work. So you're in charge. And at first that scares them, and then it could very much empower them. Students really want to know what they need to know. They don't know what that is. And so again, from my point of view, from being in chemistry, I try to really share with them a lot of very concrete examples of what they could be doing on the job when they complete the program. Success breeds success. We've probably heard this a lot. So, motivation improves. So the more successes, true successes, not kind of fake successes where we just say, oh, you're great, when there's no evidence to support that. So we need to always make sure that they're gathering evidence, we're sharing evidence, and it's very clear evidence that leads them towards what they need to do. And obviously lots of communication. This is even more so online. This is why we talk a lot over the past couple of months of how we can do this. Do we develop shared Google Docs? Do we develop chats? Do we develop whatever that might be, WeChat? But there needs to be some really clear, timely communication so that they understand when they're on track and when maybe they're not on track. So again, maybe now you're thinking, okay, I know a little research. I know it's good. I'm going to get really kind of keep drilling down to specifics, which is I think what most people need and want out of self-regulated learning. So I'm going to share with you a few prompts. This breaks all the rule of what I try to encourage people on PowerPoint slides. There's a lot of text on this. All of this will be posted on the shared Google Doc. So don't feel like you have to memorize or read all these, but I just want to share with you that here's some prompts that we may want to start to think about. So prior to the task, prior to the class, we want students to start to ask, like, what is this all about? How will I know when I've reached the goal? How interested, how motivated I am? How much time do I need? This is a big one that I learned when I worked for an engineering firm, because we had to estimate the amount of time and the budget and the people that we needed for this. And I think this is something that students don't do a very good job at. They depend on us to, well, they gave 10 homework problems for this week, so it must take a week to get it done. And maybe it does, but maybe some people need more time. So they need to start to be able to be a little bit better at estimating these times. And you might work with them, and you might do some beta testing with those. What do they already know? I mentioned before some inventory, some pre-assessments. We need to do this probably to help students figure this out on their own. Do they know a lot about this? Do they need to go backward a few chapters or a few classes to rebuild some scaffolding before they move forward? So these are some planning questions that they might want to ask. Now, during the task, they need to be this endless cycle of, am I sure I know this? And this happens a lot. A lot of students think they know something without really any evidence to indicate that. They watch you do something, you seem to make it look pretty easy. You write something down, you've got a problem, or and you just kind of work through it. But until they do it themselves, and unfortunately, when they end up doing it themselves is on a major exam or on some sort of a major assignment. And then they realize that they don't know what they're doing. They don't know how to make these connections. And so this monitoring, like what strategies are they using? Are they replicating what it is that the actions are necessary? What should I change? Why should I change it? What am I having trouble with? Really triaging some of the things that are going on. And ultimately, how are they connecting this to something else? I think far too often our students think that everything we talk about is one concept and it doesn't have anything to do with each other. I spend quite a bit of time at trying to remind that everything in chemistry really is connected, and even everything in their program is. That's why we develop a curriculum and walk them through this 4 or 12-year process, because everything that we've set up should have something to do with something else that they've learned. And if it doesn't, then chances are they might not be monitoring their learning as well as they should. And then the last portion, obviously, so they're done with the task. Okay, I'm done. And they hand it in. I encourage them before they hand it in, take a look at it. What approach did you use? I give my students rubrics, and so they literally could grade it themselves. I encourage them to share it with each other, maybe their parents, and have them grade it or assess it or look over it or give them some feedback. But taking that step and saying, what did I get out of that? Is this really correct? That's huge, because if they can ultimately diagnose some of their own weaknesses, this is going to be helpful in this whole cycle. So there's people sometimes they ask me, how can we help our students become more self-regulated? This is a large list of questions. I would not give all of these to students. I would really kind of break this down and little by little provide these. You'll find that some students really attend to some of these questions more than others, but they need to start building this into their repertoire, into their toolbox of what they might do before, during, and after. If you're really serious about this, you may actually include these on sheets, on worksheets, on homeworks, on tests. Before you hand this in, before you begin, ask yourself this question. During, halfway through their project, ask yourself these questions. And then at the very end, did you answer these questions? And so it could be literally part of the project, part of the assignment. So here's some really specific activities. Again, you may be thinking those are some great for some prompts, but how would I integrate some active learning and some active ways to help them build their self-regulated skills within my methodology, within my teaching methodology? So the most popular one, I'm sure that you've used this before, maybe you haven't thought about it as a key way to actually get students to be more self-regulating. But think, pair, share. This can be done with 1 student, 1,000 students. It's a really quick and easy formative assessment to get them to verbalize, to write, to think, to be very reflective, very metacognitive. They're going to realize when they reflect, and then when they start to talk with a partner, and nothing comes out of their mouth, or they're kind of trying to remember, and they're saying, wow, I thought I knew this, but I can't explain to you what it is that I thought I knew. So they're identifying their own gaps at that point in a smaller, lower risk, more safe environment. And then ultimately between the two of them, they can share with the group. And then each group gets to see and hear what each others are thinking, and then fill some of their own gaps. So this is a really nice, super simple way to start to do almost a daily activity to figure out and to help them become more self-regulated. Retrieval, I'm sure that you have students, I have students, we all have students that think they know something, but they don't. They watch us do something, they read, and they think that just by reading it, they can write it or they can do it, and they don't practice those skills. I do a lot of, sure, I have them read, but before we do anything, I say, can you actually do those? Whether it's literally, working with chemicals or an instrumentation or having a conversation or analyzing data. It's part of retrieving that and practicing those. And so this is something that you may build into some of your daily routine, and definitely some of your the homework. One of my favorites, and if anyone who works with me, often they know that I always rely on the information processing model because I do think it's very, very powerful. So some of the activities would to ask students to sort and to chunk and to organize. Anyone who works with concept maps or advanced organizers, that's what these are doing. They're really facilitating the brain to make sense of these by categorizing things and determining what things have in common and putting them in different areas. We should do some of this in our lesson planning, but we also should challenge our students to try to make sense of these and put them in areas so that they can actually make those connections. And then the last one is obviously they do a lot of reading, but sometimes they just read or they use a highlighter and then they get done. I never quite understand that. I'm done reading. Well, in actuality, we should be pausing and asking ourselves questions, and not just asking, but maybe we should write some of this down and formalize some of these. There's all kinds of techniques with papers and post-it notes and embedding inside, but that article, as we all know, should really be beat up. That chapter or article, whatever they're reading, it shouldn't look nice and clean in the same way that it looked before they engaged in it. It should really they should breathe their life onto that document so that that becomes theirs. So those are some basic ones. We've got that's still that list of 280 active learning techniques. Many of those, and if you didn't get that previously, I can share that with you, but many of those will allow them to really work on their self-regulation as well. Some strategies that we might think about using is obviously have students establish their learning goals. I hope they should be a representation from the outcomes. Lots and lots of practice formative assessments. Some kind of a broken record here. We talk about student response systems, low stakes, frequent, timely formative assessments where they can ultimately, without you, they can start to quiz themselves, summarize readings and notes, answer these reflective questions, write about, not just talk or not just think about, but actually write about the concepts, redo some problems that they've missed while explaining it. Using a little bit of technology, you can do this really well by asking students to use a screencasting or screen capture technique where they can actually write their problem and explain what they're doing, erase, scribble over, and then they can view that or they can share that with you, and you can really help diagnose some of the key parts that they're missing. And then obviously really describing this reasoning process. We're all making decisions, I hope, every time we do something, and sometimes verbalizing that or writing those down. Some people actually have students write a problem or write a narrative, and then they have these little gaps where they're supposed to kind of defend or show the evidence as to why they did certain steps. This is kind of a training ground, not as much for the concepts, a whole lot more for training them to be more self-regulated. All right, I'm trying to watch the time. I'm talking a lot. I'm going to pause just for a second to see if there are any questions. I know that was a lot of information. I'm hoping that kind of share it in a way that I can imagine that everyone has engaged in something with their students, either not being able to self-direct, self-regulate, probably being online even more the past couple of months. This has really started to become an issue because we can't always be there and we can't always answer their questions. I think this is one of the few benefits out of this time period is we need to really help students become more self-regulated now, because this is going to be a skill that's going to be hugely beneficial as they progress in their academic and in their professional careers. Okay, I don't see any questions there. This is some recent research that I just thought I would share. There's no surprises here that there's some really clear research on what students are doing or aren't doing that's really kind of keeping them back from becoming more efficient at self-regulating, right? They're not setting goals. They're not creating some sort of a plan. Their time management, I think we could talk about this forever. I really am puzzled, to be quite honest, sometime that people in general, at whatever age, whatever level, really have a hard time managing their time. We've got calendars and schedules, and we've got alarms on our phones, and we've got all these things. I even had a student that missed an office hour, and he said that he had it. He put it in his calendar. He heard the ringing of and he literally turned it off, almost like a reflex, like he turns off all of his alarm, and then forgot it. And so it isn't as simple as setting an alarm or putting it on a calendar. You know, we need to have some really key skills to help us make sure that we're managing these times. Elaboration, which just means you're taking those concepts and you're extending, you're elaborating, you're verbalizing, you're doing something with the material. You're not just visiting that material once. Self-evaluation or peer evaluation or colleague evaluation, at talking to folks in your class. And this is why there's a lot of power in peer learning. Unfortunately, I seldom see it structured well. Many times it's just, you know, talk to a neighbor instead of here's some prompts that you need to use. Here's some really evidence that you need to collect. Here's some hard questions that you need to ask each other. And ultimately, the data really from this research indicates that students, for some reason, they just refuse to seek help. And I think that that's a whole other layer that we can talk about at some point, is how we can make seeking help a positive instead of a negative. So here's some behaviors, you know, so these are some of the things that we might think about what students should be doing. And we all know that, you know, teaching is a social science, learning is a social science. People will be thinking about some of these behaviors along the way. I do see a chat. Let me just check that really quick. Okay, great. Feel free to continue to share some chats, and I will definitely try to get to those. So students, they should be seeking some assistance. Now, how do they know to do this, right? Those questions that they're answering when they're doing the self-regulation should you know, enlighten them to do those. They should make a schedule. I don't know about you, but I literally walk students through my scheduling techniques. It's not that mine are perfect. I tend to be just really crazy about and neurotic about my scheduling. But I try to, you know, encourage them. Here's one way to manage your time. And then I end up talking to them individually and literally walking them through and helping each of them develop their own time management skills. And then obviously, this really has become huge. I've been working on Zoom now for 6 months, and it's been both fun and just exhausting. But the one thing that I'm realizing when I observe classrooms, and I do a lot of classroom observations online, is that a lot of times we're not being really clear with students, not on what they have to do, but we need to recommend. You know, we really are at a point where we can share with them what should the environment look like. When we're all in the classroom, we control the classroom, we can control the temperature and the air conditioning and the seatings and the boards, and we control all of that. But when they're online, they are controlling or not controlling that. And so, you know, where are they? Is it quiet? Are they at a desk? I see more and more, you know, dogs and cats and people stepping in and people on their beds and all these things. And I'm not here to tell you what they should do, but I do think that all of those could be potential distractions to real time, synchronous, asynchronous, but they also can be distractions when students are trying to self-regulate, when they're trying to make sense of things and they're constantly trying to be, you know, being pulled away from other physical things. There was a trick that once we started to get involved in a lot of the online stuff, people, if you really do want to focus, whether it be a class or a lot of early career faculty who are trying to do some research, is to find yourself not only a quiet place, but disconnect your Wi-Fi so that you know, you're not seeing these messages pop up from Facebook or from email. And I don't know about you, but it's difficult to for the best of us to stay focused on something when we're constantly know that somebody might be on the other end of that email. Now, we always know the emails are rarely that important, but we think that we need to be attentive to some of that. So these are just some things we might want to coach our students into thinking about. And then keeping this study log. I think sometimes they think, oh, I read that. Oh, I've been studying all night. And I'll usually sit down with them and I'll unpack that. I'll say, I'm just curious, like what your habits are like. So you went home and well, I had a snack and they'll literally, they won't lie. They'll talk to you exactly what they did. And I'm jotting down notes, and out of a 6-hour period from 5 to 11 p.m., they studied like 1 hour. In their mind though, they thought they were studying for 6 hours because they had the book out and they had intentions to do it. And so they're really confused why in their mind they thought they studied 6 hours and they did poorly on the exam. And I know it sounds like common sense, but sometimes they just need to hear that. And then ultimately, they need to contact the instructor. And this sounds super easy, but at the same time, students are typically intimidated by instructors. They're maybe afraid, or there's a stigma, there's all these things. So we need to take some responsibility to minimize some of those things and really make sure that they know that we're here for support and for assistance. So at the same time, you know, we need to be thinking about some things. So the instructors should obviously provide, you know, clear instructions, overly clear, beta test their instructions, lots of organizations for ourselves. If we aren't self-regulating, chances are they're not going to see that it's important. And then ultimately we need to design in our course designs these short-term goals, you know, check and balances. I call them milestones or benchmarks, you know, quality control checks of how do I know that I'm on task. And then ultimately, one of the biggest things that the first thing that people will recommend for self-regulation is to develop some checklists for students. And those checklists could include some of the prompts that I've just shared earlier. There could be subcategories for self-efficacy, metacognition. You wouldn't call them that, but there would be some really intentional things of students. Have you done this? Have you monitored this? How do you know this? And then they just write in a little bit of things. They don't need this forever, but they may need it as kind of a training mechanism so that they know when they're on task. So what does a good online student self-regulating learner look like? This was some interesting research just a couple of years ago. They do have what's called super self-regulated learners. As you might imagine, a smaller percentage, so about 20% of our students are this, and they're using a large variety. So everything that I just shared with you, they're using a lot of these techniques. They're using the checklist, they're gathering evidence. So these are obviously some of our high achievers. We have some that are confident, right? They're going to use these as needed. So they're not really buying into the fact that these are lifelong strategies. They have a problem, they reach in the toolbox, and they use what's needed. They put it back in the toolbox, and they really don't want anything to do with it. And so they're hesitant to really use much more and really to integrate them into their approach. And that's a lot of those, right? So we're about half, 40% of our students are doing some of this. We do have some that are very specific. So they're using them as a performance base. So they're trying to develop task strategies and time management. The problem with this is they're only using it within context, and the millisecond that they don't need to, you know, they're gone on to something else and usually not having any kind of strategies. About 10% are using them for these, you know, goal settings, but really nothing else. And so they begin to use them, but they don't follow through. And then obviously there's a decent percentage of them that have zero skills, tendency. They're not using any of these at all. And those are obviously some of our less attentive, less performing. And so I see there's half of our students probably could use a lot more updates and training and information about how they can become more self-regulated. Good. All right, I've got about 10 minutes left, and I think this is the last slide, because I wanted to share everything that I just shared is research that's been done over the past 5, 10, 15 years. I do want to share some recent research about the future. I think it would be a bit unethical not to share what's going on. There's some really interesting / scary / invasive, call it what you want. To me, it's just interesting because there's some ways that people are starting to think about how we can really monitor self-regulated learning. So using this formative assessment approach, and keep in mind, a formative assessment isn't just a quiz, it isn't just a student response system or a polling, it's anything at all that allows us to collect behavioral data in the formation of learning something. So that's why it's so great with self-regulation, because you can collect some data and then that informs you of the next step. So, do I know this? Let me collect some data. Oh, I do know this, I can move on. Oh, I don't know this, I need to remediate. And so a formative assessment approach is really integral for self-regulation. Learning analytics has become a really big part. These terms that I'm gonna share, I'm sure that you've heard about them. Maybe you're deeply involved in them. This has happened for a lot of startups. A lot of really progressive school districts are starting to think about some of these. I do want to share right up front that I'm not endorsing these. I try not to endorse any research. I share research. I explore research. I analyze research. Some of these can be great, but keep in mind, these are really pretty new research ideas. So we always need to be cautious with thinking that they're going to be perfect or they're going to be the answer. often there's portions of these that we can use. So learning analytics involve a lot of different things, but they're basically about collecting a bunch of data, and it could be all kinds of data. It's not just test data, but it's behavioral data, and then trying to make sense of that analytics. There's several ways that we can do this. One is more kind of efforts on the students, and so something like tracking tags. And we do this a lot of times. I know when I publish a paper, I have to put down keywords on my article, and that simply means that if you're going to search for something and you want to find my article, I'm putting words down there so that when you do a Google search, it's easier to find those. Similarly, tags, which are on social medias, is that the students would basically tag certain areas of their products, of their writings, that allows those to be tracked and analyzed and gathered and congregated. And so this is some things like things that they can and can't do. If you were to go back and then analyze those, it would kind of categorize those and help them almost develop a targeted approach to the things that they needed to learn more about. Data mining, machine learning, these are some concepts that have got some really complex ideas out there, and some softwares that allows us to go and really grab bunches of data, sort that data. The one thing that I always caution people with, and I think this is part of the arts and science of teaching, is that the science, you can get the data, and the data can look pretty, and you can do stats on it, but we do still need to realize that these are humans, they behave like humans. We need to probably think about this data in a humanistic way. How can we apply that data on an individual way that students can actually use it and benefit from that? And then ultimately, there's these dashboards. I'm sure if you're using any kind of a learning or course management system, it provides you a dashboard. And those are, students' grades or quizzes or what they've done, what they've handed in. They also, some of the LMSs, learning management systems, are providing dashboards on the amount of time students spend at each web page, where they click from or where they go. This isn't actually new. I was doing this 20 years ago as well. My dissertation, I was trying to monitor whether students were actually addressing these concepts in an objectivist or a constructivist point of view, so linear or nonlinear. And so we tracked the clicks that they were making. And if they clicked, one kind of a lower level concept, and then the next and the next and the next, or they just kind of went like a spider web and they were clicking everywhere. So those clicks sometimes allows us to know how they're learning, how they're regulating, if they're asking certain questions, and by gathering a click here and feedback and reading this page, what led them to the next page, what led them to the next page. So this also helps in course design of knowing how we should provide resources so everybody can access some of those. So dashboards are somewhat interesting. And then there's more and more going on with really kind of intensive, this eye movement, face recognition. I actually published a paper with a colleague of mine a couple of years ago that what we were trying to do was to develop a system where students would, on their mobile phones, they would literally scroll up and down as they saw a PowerPoint slide, whether they were confused or not. And so the faculty member, the teacher, would have a dashboard on the presentation on the computer that just gave a little kind of a chart. And if things were going well, it would be kind of a green line. But then if a lot of students were getting confused, that line would go up. And the faculty would, without doing any kind of a student response system or polling or quizzing, they would know that they needed to pause because there was a large percentage of students that were getting confused on that particular screen. And so this is a manual way to do this. They're now looking at, and this is a little bit science fiction maybe at this time, but looking to have cameras that recognize facial features that could be related to confusion. And then that would relay that information to the teacher. And so if half of your students have a puzzled look on their face, or their eyes become dilated, or these would be attributes that they're trying to test to see that they would be indicators of confusion, then the faculty member can pause and go back and do some things that this would help students realize that they don't know what's going on. And for me, a bit of a training ground to, when they feel that way, they may not have known that they feel that way at the time, but they should recognize that feeling now. And in the future, that's part of the self-regulation cycle, is when I'm confused, I should do something different as opposed to just do nothing or hope that I'll get unconfused. Typically, we need to have an action to get us out of that. And Piaget talks about this really clearly with his disequilibrium theory. You may recall some of this, that when we reach something that we really don't understand, we either accommodate or we assimilate. And so that's part of the cycle as well. We need to be constantly thinking about this. Learning is a very dynamic, high impact kind of a sport if we're doing it well. So lastly, that's kind of the summary of everything, and I'm right at just about 5 minutes left. I want to pause now, and I'll take some questions. I will go ahead and stop the recording.